We now come to the second video in my series on the French defence, this easy yet rather deep and hopefully effective guide to learning the French defence. And we are now going to look at the groan variation. And that variation is the exchange French. And I call it the groan variation. This is the variation after e4, e6, d4, d5, the normal starting plan for the French. Get your pawn like structure like that, defending each other, the pawn chain. And now the exchange French is the move e takes d5. Now, you will rarely ever see this move being played at grandmaster level or above. It's a move that you will normally only see lower down, I would say at club level. And it has this reputation of being very equal and drawish. Now, you should really take back your pawn here. And the reason it has this reputation is because of the symmetrical pawn structure, and there's not much going on here. But I'm going to show you some little tips here that you can play with black to try to make the position a bit more exciting and a bit more sort of go for the attack here. I mean, there's a funny story actually in this. I mean, strong English Grandmaster Nigel Short, who got to the final of the World Championship match against Kasparov in '92. On his way to playing Kasparov, he had to first play some other matches. And one of the players he was playing was Gurevich, very strong player who I believe now lives in Turkey. And Gurevich only needed a draw with the white pieces against Nigel to progress to the next stage. And Gurevich played the exchange French, and they reached this position here. Gurevich thinking he's a very strong player, 2650 plus, thinking he'd get an easy draw because he's played the boring groan variation. But Nigel just simply outplayed him and taught him a lesson and won the game very nicely. Now, in general, when you have any symmetrical position, any symmetrical opening, it's going to be the better player who is going to win the game because it's more on maneuvering and where you should put your pieces. Now, as a very quick tip to this position, okay, you have two ways of playing with black, and so does white actually. Now, if you want to play this position very solidly and very safely, I suggest that you set up in the following manner, and that is with pawn to c6. And you're kind of doing a French defense with your pawns the other way, erecting a very strong pawn structure the other way there. So pawn to c6 is a very solid way of playing. And then your dark square bishop, I'd say, goes to d6. And then I actually like moving my knight on g8 to e7. My bishop on c8 goes to f5, and I castle kingside. Now, that is a basic setup you can play if you want to go for a very equal, solid position and you think you can outplay your opponent. It's a very good way to set your pieces up, and that's what I'll play generally most of the time. Now, I should point out which pieces should you be trying to exchange and which pieces should you be trying to avoid exchanging. Well, in general, which bishop do you think is your best bishop? Have a think about this yourself, your light square bishop or your dark square bishop. Now, generally in the French, your dark square bishop is your better bishop and your light square bishop is your worst bishop. And that is the case here. The light square bishop is your worst bishop because you already have a couple of pawns, mainly the one on d5 on a light square, and it restricts the movement of your light squared bishop. So it can never really go to this diagonal, I've just highlighted, because the pawn is in the way. So this is your bad bishop. And generally what you want to do is swap this bishop off, the light square bishop, for your opponent's light square bishop. And remember in that last development plan, I recommended you go knight e7 after the bishop comes to d6, of course, and bishop to f5. Well, I recommend this way of setting up because it's most likely white's going to put his bishop on d3. And then you can get rid of your bad bishop for your opponent's good bishop. Your knight on e7 supports the bishop coming to f5. So your good bishop, that means, is your dark square bishop, and ideally this bishop would like to come to d6 and remain on this lovely diagonal b8 to h7. So they're just some very small tips if you want to play in a very solid way. Now, if you want to make the position a bit more interesting, if white plays in a solid manner, then you can play the move c5. And we'll look at this very shortly. And this leads to very dynamic positions, which are called isolated pawn positions, because white will generally take on c5 at some point. And then you have this pawn on d5, which is an isolated pawn, and it makes the position less symmetrical and slightly more interesting because you've mixed up the dynamics of the position. You've created unbalance in the position. Of course, white can do the same. Let's just think about this from the other side. It's a symmetrical position. So when you understand your ideas, you should also understand white's ideas. And I'm giving you a big talk through the moves here, just so you have a better idea what you should be trying to do in this position already. The same goes for white. Now, white can either go c4 and go for an isolated pawn position himself, or he can play in a slower manner. Well, let's just have a look at what white can do. Now, there's three main moves: bishop d3, knight to f3, or the move c4. Now, let's have a look at c4 first. So this is when white's trying to unbalance the position and go for something a bit more murky. Now, in general, positionally speaking, your pawn structure is going to be better when you take on c4 because white has this weakness on d4. This is an isolated pawn, but white's pieces will become a little bit stronger. Now, my general setup here would be to develop your knight to f6 and your bishop to b4 or to e7 very quickly so you can get castled. Get your king castled first, so you need to move out the pieces in the way of your king quickly. And generally, you always develop your knights before your bishops. So a very simple way of playing against c4 is to knight out first, and then let's say white brings his knight out. Well, let's move our bishop to b4 because we get it there with a check. Knight to c3, and now we can get castled. So our king is now a bit safer. And now, one of the major rules of this move c4 is we are going to take on c4 at some point, but we're only going to take on the c4 when white has wasted a move of moving his light squared bishop one square. So, for example, here, white needs to get his king castled, so he has to move the bishop on f1 at some point. And as soon as he moves that bishop, we can take on c4. And this saves us the tempo because white really has to win that pawn back and recapture on c4 with his bishop. So he's wasted a move. Now, just imagine in this position, instead of castling kingside here, imagine we took on c4 here. Well, white would save a whole tempo because he'd take on c4 in one move. So this is clearly not a good idea. So first rule to remember, when white has played c4, is to wait until he's moved his light square bishop, only then take on c4. And here, just try to laterally think where your pieces are best placed. And, well, you need to get your bishop on c8 in the game, your knight on b8. And it looks to me that bishop to g4 is a great move. Now, you could go rook to e8 check, but bishop to e3 doesn't really help you so much. So I prefer bishop to g4 here. And now, after castling, the d4 pawn is our opponent's isolated pawn, so let's put pressure on that square and develop a piece, knight to c6. And already I think black is absolutely fine here. You have very nice development and you're threatening to take on f3 and in some positions take on d4. Now, there's one crafty idea here from black. After bishop to e3, defending d4, I like the strange looking move here, rook to b8. Now, you might be thinking, what on earth are you suggesting with this move rook to b8, Mr. Williams? Well, the idea is I would like to take on f3, and after queen takes f3, win this pawn on d4. But now maybe you see a problem with this variation. White can go queen takes b7. So by simply playing rook to b8 first, I renew the threat of taking on f3 and taking on d4. And it's quite hard for black to stop this. And for white to stop this. So what does white do in this position? Well, if he breaks the pin with bishop to e2, we see a standard idea in this isolated pawn position. The ex-world champion Spassky said it's not the isolated pawn, which in this case the pawn on d4, which is the weakness, it's the square in front of the isolated pawn, which is the weakness, so d5. Because white can never, ever attack that square on d5 with his c pawn or his e pawn. They've been removed from the board. And here we can just go knight to d5 and take control of this square in front of the isolated pawn. General rule in isolated pawn positions, if you are playing against the isolated pawn, you want to exchange off as many pieces as you possibly can, because the more near an ending you get, the weaker the isolated pawn will become. On the reverse of that, of course, switch that around. If you are playing with the isolated pawn, so from the white perspective here, you want to keep pieces on the board and keep your pieces active. But this hasn't worked for white so well in this opening. So let's go back. Okay, so after the exchange French, if white plays c4, I suggest we develop our kingside quickly. Knight to f6, bishop to b4 check, and we wait to capture on c4 only when white has moved the bishop on f1. But generally, white won't play this c4 move as often as he'll play other options. So I'm just now going to show you the flip side of that. What happens if white plays bishop to d3? Well, again, here you have two options. And c6 is the most solid way to play. And this gains instant equality. If you go c6, you set up, as we said before, bishop to d6, knight to e7, bishop to f5. And this is an equal position, a safe way of playing. And the better player will win this. But what happens if you now try the idea white just tried? Well, it can be similar. Let's just see if we can improve on some of these sort of moves that we were suggesting here. So instead of the move c6, what if we go c5? Well, I saw a game in Nakamura's actually after this move, which now continued knight to f3. And now here, well, I mean, again, there's a lot of things that can happen. I mean, if white takes on c5, he's breaking the rule of not waiting until the dark square bishop has moved. And here, black can get very active, like bishop takes, knight to f6. And if castles, something like knight d2, knight to c6. We just develop our pieces very naturally here. And there's one move I want to point out. After the move h3, stopping bishop to g4, I wanted to jump forward to this position. A very strong idea here. We're going to see this, Korchnoi use this idea in the main game, is the move queen to d6. With potential ideas of moving this queen at some point into the g3 square. So I just wanted to point out this crazy idea, and that works because of the pin on the f pawn. Interesting idea. Okay, but let's say white plays a bit better after c5. Instead of taking on c5, let's say knight to f3. Well, now we should develop normally knight to c6, and white here should probably also develop normally or play a move like castles, but we should note he hasn't gone bishop to b5, and this is one move that black played but white hasn't been able to play, so we've gained a little bit from the black perspective of doing this. Now, if white does try to be greedy, I just want to have a look at this with queen to e2 check. You shouldn't worry about white capturing this pawn on c5 if you get quick development. For example, bishop to e7, and now if white takes on c5, speedy development. And by playing the c5 move, we have mixed up the position. So knight to f6. And now after something like h3 is a useful move because it stops bishop to g4. I mean, another rule you should bear in mind, if white doesn't play the move h3, then your light square bishops zoom into the square g4. For example, let's say white castled here. Well, you could castle, of course, but bishop to g4 would be another very tempting move. Now you are threatening knight to d4 next, and this would be rocking and rolling on the king side. So this is why h3 is quite popular. But now let's just play some natural moves, for example, castles. Let's say white castles. Now we can win our pawn on c5 back. Bishop takes c5. And now c3 here. Well, let's attack that queen. Rook to e8. Where does the queen go? Queen c2. And can you remember this key idea now? This key idea is if white has played h3, we have our bishop on c5. What clever idea can we try to do to generate an attack against our opponent's king? Queen d6. I really like this idea, and there's been a number of games in this, but one game we had where Korchnoi won with the black pieces. Korchnoi, one of the most famous French defense players of all time, Continued knight on b to d2. And now look, queen to g3. What a beautiful idea. The threat is bishop takes h3, checkmate on g2. And the queen cannot be taken because of the pawn on the f-file. And now, well, what does white do? Well, he tried bishop to f5, blocking the bishop's route to h3. But now rook to e2. The rook came in, pressurizing f2. And we can already see white's position completely collapsing. Knight to d4, but now simply knight takes d4. Okay, white could have taken the queen on g3, but then black takes the queen on c2 with check. So white actually resigned there already. That just shows you some of the dangers that white can get himself into. The worst player, and the worst player will generally lose in this exchange French. But I want to give you these two setups you can adjust to. And if you're learning any opening, you should play some blitz games first. So in the French defense, do experiment with this c6 solid setup, but also have a look at the c5 idea. Now, the last way that the game can continue is after knight to f3. And we've only looked at bishop d3 and c4 so far. So what should we do after knight to f3? Well, I think in this line, I think you should now go c6. Because the problem is, if you go c5 now, white can go bishop b5 check in one move. And is a tempo up over the same plan we had for black here. And I think this will give him a very good position. I generally only go c5 myself if my opponent first moves his bishop, his light square bishop to d3. Only then do I go c5. Because if he goes bishop b5 check, then he's lost the tempo. So after knight to f3, we're now going to look at a game where this solid c6 move was used. And I recommend this. And we just want to go bishop d6, knight e7, etc. So let's just see an example of this in action. So bishop to d3 looks like a sensible move. We move our bishop to d6. Remember how we're developing. You should be able to remember this. And also try to remember which bishop is your best bishop, which bishop is your worst bishop, which bishop are you trying to exchange off the board. So castles here. And now, where do you put the knight on g8 and why? Every move you play should have a reason. Knight to e7. Why do we move it there? Well, I like moving it there because I want to go bishop to f5, where the knight is supporting the bishop. And I want to swap off my slightly bad French bishop on c8 for the better bishop on d3. Now, I'm also given a chance, I might just play bishop to g4 here. That's also a nice idea. So h3 is a common idea. A trick you must be a little bit wary of sometimes is castling. It doesn't work here, but just remember, if you do castle, bishop takes h7. It doesn't work in this position, but just bear in mind this idea. But there was a game, Nakamura, where Nakamura won very happily and very quickly in this position. If Nakamura can play the exchange French, well, it's good enough for him. It's good enough for me. He just played h6 first, stopping any tricks controlling this. And after rook to e1, well, he could have simply castled here and gone bishop to f5, but instead he wanted to develop all his minor pieces first. So Nakamura just went bishop to e6. And after knight d2, he got his last piece out, which is the knight on b8. Knight d7. White went knight to f1. And now a very aggressive setup from Nakamura. We wouldn't expect anything else. And this is one more idea I wanted to show you. Queen to c7. And in actual fact, Hikaru is not going to castle kingside. He is going to castle queenside and throw all his pawns at his opponent's king. So this is yet another way to make the exchange French interesting. And Nakamura won very nicely after c3. g5 was coming up, but castles first. b4 and g5. Typical pawn storms on opposite sides. Knight to h2, and now rook comes to g8, preparing to go g4, opening up lines. Remember, when you're casting on opposite sides of the board, you need to open up lines against your opponent's king. a4, h5. At least we have an exciting position. b4, g4, and Nakamura seemed to be a little bit quicker with the attack there. So just to sum up, the exchange French, the grown variation, can be more interesting than people think. If white goes c4 here himself, I suggest we take advantage of this move by first going knight to f6 And then using the point, we can check on b4 to check on b4. And we want to ideally develop our bishop to g4, castle our king, and our knight to c6. So that's against c4. Now, if our opponent does bishop to d3, this means he will have to waste a move going bishop to b5 check at a later moment after c5. So we can play c5 ourselves and go for this line that's Korchnoi played. So that's an interesting option. Or if you want to be safe, just go c6. Now, after knight to f3, we now go for our c6 strategy. I think this is the correct way to play. And we develop with our bishop on d6, after something like castles, our knight to e7, nice move. And then you have two strategies here. If you want to play the safe system, you can castle kingside and try to go bishop to f5. If you want to play the Nakamura system, let's be honest, who doesn't? You should go h6 first, bishop e6, knight d7, queen e7, castles queenside. Why do you go h6 first, you might be thinking? Well, let's just say after a move like knight d2, if you go bishop e6 first, white has the annoying move knight to g5. So after something like knight b d2, go h6 first. It stops anything coming there. Rook e1. Then you finish your development. Knight to d7. And you can even castle queenside here. Queen c7, castles queenside, and throw Gary the g-pawn and Frederick the c-pawn up the board. So at least hopefully this video will give you some exciting ways to play against the Exchange French, and it certainly won't be boring if you stick to the ideas given in this video.